Welcome to Who's That Pokémon, the only twice-weekly Pokémon anime rewatch podcast on the entire internet. If you didn't know, this is a retrospective look back on the Pokémon anime series, episode by episode from the very beginning. This show has been airing for over 20 years now and has over 1,000 episodes, yet it always seemed like it was neglected by Pokémon fans when it came to the podcast space, so I thought it was about time it got one dedicated entirely to it. Let's jump straight into the episode this week. This week's episode is episode 3 of the Indigo League season, titled Ash Catches a Pokémon. The Japanese title for this episode is I Caught a Pokémon, and we have our first bit of trivia very early on in the episode. It is a bit of a pedantic one, but a lot of them kind of are at this point. The trivia for this title is that despite it being Ash catches a Pokemon, Ash actually catches 2 Pokemon. So both the Japanese and the dub title are technically they're not wrong, but they're not completely truthful too, because Ash is catching 2 Pokemon in this episode. This episode first aired in Japan on April 15, 1997, and in the United States on September 10, 1998. This episode aired a day after Pokémon Emergency, which is the first time the series had done so in the West, and this would go a long way in helping the dub catch up with the Japanese airing, because from this point, Pokémon would basically air Monday to Friday, which allowed them to catch up significantly, which Pokémon in Japan was just airing once a week, obviously. Obviously, they couldn't physically do 5 episodes a week over there. But yeah, they do this until, I'm not entirely sure when they stop going Monday through Friday and take a little break. It might be at the end of the first dub season. If not, maybe going into Orange Islands. They definitely do take a break at some point because they make quick ground on, catching up on Japan, and then they have to ease off a little bit so they don't catch up completely. So on this day in Pokemon history for the Japanese air date, we've got the Nintendo DSi XL being released in Australia in 2010, which is one of the few DS variations that I didn't own back then. I had a original big chunky DS, I had a DS Lite, and then I eventually got a DSi. But by the time I got a DSi, I was kind of, I think I have enough DSs at this point. And, you only really need 2, so you can trade back and forth for Pokemon. And I had 3, so a 4th would have definitely been overkill. Even though the extra large screen would have been nice, but it wasn't enough to tempt me. And on this day in Pokemon history for the American air date, it's Tomo Sakurai's birthday. She is the Japanese voice actress for Cynthia, Sinnoh's Pokemon League champion, who has appeared infrequently throughout the anime since the Sinnoh arc. So I've neglected to do this for the first couple of episodes, but it's something I want to introduce now, and it's kind of mentioning who wrote the screenplay for the episode. I wanted to initially do who directed the episode. I thought maybe they would throw the directing responsibilities around, but the information I could find wasn't great. There wasn't a whole lot of information, but it appears that they've had the same director for the entire show's run, which seemed a little weird to me, but also at the same time, it seems like it makes perfect sense. But we do see a bit of variation in the screenplay writers. You'll see a lot of recurring faces, but it will be interesting to see what we think of episodes written by certain people. So this one was written by Atsuhiro Tomioka. This was the first episode not to be written by Takeshi Shudo, as he wrote the first 2 episodes of the anime. And Tomioka is still writing on the show today, as many of the writers that were writing for this first season. So we move on to the debuts now, and there are 0 debuts of recurring human characters here. This is the first time it's happened in the show's history, and I've got a bit of trivia later on about the amount of characters in this episode, but let's just say it's not surprising that no recurring characters debut here. We have the Pokemon debuts, and we see Ash's Pidgeotto, Ash's Metapod, Butterfree, and Beedrill debuting here. And the Who's That Pokemon? Well, it's none other than Caterpie, Ash's very first Pokemon that he caught himself. So, with all of the episode info out of the way, let's head into the episode summary and discussion. Ash Catches a Pokemon actually leads straight in from the last episode. It quite literally picks up right where the episode 2 Pokemon Emergency had finished, which is not something you see too often. You'll see it if they are doing a specific 2-part or multi-episode story arc, but this isn't really a multi-episode story arc here. It just so happens that they decided that they would end Pokemon Emergency on kind of a cliffhanger and then roll straight into it here, which is something you really don't see too often in the show's history. And again, as I've mentioned a lot through the first few episodes of this podcast, they're still kind of finding their footing with the show and discovering what kind of direction they want to take it. And as seen here, it feels like they want a kind of narrative linking the end of each episode into the beginning of the next episode. You see it with the first one where Ash and Pikachu kind of, they see Viridian City on the horizon and we see that they're really close. And then the next episode, it basically kicks off with them walking straight into Viridian City. Then 2 to 3, leads in with the catching the Pokemon, and it kind of does it with this episode and the next episode, but not really. It sort of starts to die off a little bit around here. It doesn't die off completely, but yeah, you can see that they're kind of, I guess maybe not too big of a fan of this sort of idea. So, as for the actual episode, let's get into it. Picking up right where the previous episode left off, Ash throws his Pokeball at a Caterpie in Viridian Forest. It attempts to break free, but is unsuccessful. Ash celebrates catching his first Pokemon, holding the Pokeball and running in circles of joy. When Ash holds the Pokeball closer to Misty's face, she reveals that she has a fear of bugs, even if they are contained in a Pokeball. Pikachu is happy to have Caterpie along, and Ash decides to bring Caterpie out, scaring Misty away. Caterpie wants to make friends with Misty, but she prefers Pikachu. Ash is offended by Misty's discomfort and complaints, which hurt Caterpie's feelings. Ash reassures Caterpie and continues travelling on without Misty. However, Misty has other plans. She's still upset about her ruined bicycle and still wants Ash to replace it, so she's going to continue following Ash, albeit at a pretty strict distance for the time being. I think it's interesting that they have Ash capture Caterpie without battling it, after in the first episode they emphasize so heavily that you want to battle the Pokemon before attempting to catch it. Of course, in the first episode, Ash attempts to catch a Pidgey purely just by throwing the ball at it, and Dexter has to kind of smarten him up and say, you know, generally trainers try to weaken the Pokemon first before they catch it. So maybe try doing that. But here he just does the same thing and it works, which is kind of a theme for Ash. He'll do something, fail, then do it again, change up absolutely nothing, and have success. Ash vows to catch a whole bunch of new friends after he catches Caterpie, which is something he never really sticks to. He's actually pretty damn selective over what he catches, which I found a little humorous. They'll encounter so many just random wild Pokemon that he could attempt to catch, and he really just shows no interest. So he's really not too focused on catching a bunch of new friends. He's more on catching... He's quality over quantity, this Ash Ketchum fella. I think they also do a pretty good job of making Caterpie kind of cute here. It is like a big bug. That's exactly what it is. But I think with the sort of mannerisms, the way it reacts to Misty being just so damn blunt towards it, it does actually a pretty good job of making it cute. We actually have in this very first scene a error already, which is in the shot right before Caterpie dashes over to Misty. She's partially hiding behind a tree, and the trees behind her are obscured by bushes. But when Misty backs away from Caterpie, the bushes and the trees disappear. And we have a couple of dub changes too. In the scene where Misty tells Ash about the 3 things she hates, Ash complains about girls and their selfishness. In the dub, though, she says that bugs are one of the 3 things most disgusting in the world, and then Ash asks her what the disgusting things are aside from herself. And the second dub change we have here is that the way Misty and Ash comment on Caterpie is kind of different between each version. This is due to religious censorship. They really strayed away from having any sort of nod to any sort of religious concept in the early days. Again, I think it's kind of like the violence they removed in the first episode. They don't want to really risk having a bit of a parent backlash early on in the show's life cycle. So in the dub, Ash mentions how he loves Caterpie, and Misty sarcastically responds how it takes a worm to love a worm. Whereas in the original version, Ash comments that he and Caterpie are the same kind of heaven, and Misty retorts that their heaven is her hell. So you can kind of see why they completely changed the sort of meaning of that conversation, because even this day and age, I can't really imagine them saying that sort of line. Later that night, Ash sets up camp, and Misty, who's also getting ready to go to sleep, exchanges a few smart remarks with Ash, which upsets Pikachu and Caterpie. While Ash and Misty doze off to sleep, Pikachu and Caterpie actually get to know each other a little better here. And I really like this scene. It's a really sweet scene between Caterpie and Pikachu talking in front of the moon, and I just think it's so nice to see Ash's only 2 party members kind of bonding here, and it kind of makes sense. It's what you would see. Pokemon are they're the animals of the Pokemon world, but they're also pretty close to being like human-like beings. They're pretty close to humans in terms of intelligence. So you would definitely see this if Pikachu's the only one in the party. Even if there was more in the party, you would probably have them introducing themselves to the newest member, which I really dug, and I thought it was cool that they didn't bother to, overlay any subtitles to kind of try and tell us what Pikachu and Caterpie were saying. I like that it's left up to your imagination, and you can do a pretty good job of inferring kind of what the conversation is about just by the actions and the sort of tone of each Pokemon's voice. And here we actually see the first instance, really, of the show's writers giving Ash's Caterpie a ton of character development. And overall, this is a theme that Ash's Caterpie sort of carries. It gets a lot of character development, and I'm not sure if at this point they realised that Ash was going to release Butterfree later on in a pretty emotional moment, and they were thinking, you know what, to make that emotional moment properly stick, we've kind of got to build it up to be a decently fleshed out character, so the audience will care when he actually releases it. But yeah, there's a ton of character development in this episode, and then we see further character development basically in the next episode as well. And it's actually probably one of the better developed Pokemon that Ash has in the Indigo League, which, there's not a whole lot of competition when you consider things like Krabby and Tauros and all that. But yeah, I really do enjoy it, and it's something that comes so early on, which you might not expect when you go back and rewatch the show. So they all wake up the next morning, and Misty remains frightened of Caterpie, causing the Pokemon to become subdued and actually return to its Pokeball, which is pretty dramatic. Ash gets pretty angry about Misty's continued disrespect towards his newest capture, but he can't be angry for too long as a wild Pidgeotto takes his attention. He wants to catch Pidgeotto, and Ash throws a Pokeball, but Pidgeotto simply spots it away. Misty retorts that a trainer needs to battle and weaken a wild Pokemon to capture it. She then mentions that he caught a Caterpie only because it was weak, irritating Ash, who summons Caterpie to battle it despite the type disadvantage. Misty and Pikachu are both aware of this, but Ash is completely oblivious. However, he does recall Caterpie just in time, causing Pidgeotto to get its beak stuck in a tree. Ash failing dismally at catching Pidgeotto at first really emphasises how weak Caterpie is. And even they have Misty outright say it, that Caterpie is incredibly weak. But like, it's kind of disproven later on in the episode, as Caterpie is shown to really not be that weak. So there's kind of a bit of disjointedness there, where they're emphasizing Caterpie being weak, and you can't really write it off as just Misty being mean to Caterpie, because Ash did capture Caterpie with one Pokeball without doing a single scratch of damage to it. So they're implying that it's weak, and then later on they're like, whoa, this Caterpie is actually pretty strong. So I thought that was a little bit off, I guess. I think Ash using his Caterpie against Pidgeotto does a pretty good job of emphasizing how much of a rookie Ash is at this point. The whole scene really shows just how far he has to go to become a competent trainer. He really is starting at square one. He knows absolutely nothing. And I think this is great for his character development. They could have easily made Ash semi-competent to start off with, but I like that they do make him completely just a blank slate, because it goes so well with everybody would have been coming into this anime with fresh eyes, not knowing what Pokemon is, and of course so many kids would have been getting their first Pokemon fix through this. So having Ash be the kind of audience surrogate is just, the perfect way to go about things, I think. Here we have Ash in this little scene say, if you just try hard enough, things will work out, won't they? And they often go out of their way to dismiss Ash's way of thinking here. They do so in this episode. Misty shoots it down big time. Yet, in reality, most of the time, this works out pretty well for him in the Indigo League. He gets most of his gym badges by following this motto of just trying hard enough and things working out, not really having to adjust strategy. You just keep doing it over and over again. We'll get to it in a little bit. The Pewter City Gym episode, where Ash kind of does this. He does, to be fair, does do a bit of training, but he still just is kind of smacking his head against the wall, hoping he can brute force his way through it. And then he does this basically with half the gyms, maybe even more, and he's just rewarded for trying hard and, good job, which goes against the motto here that's being shot down. So moving on, Ash sends Pikachu after Pidgeotto just as it frees itself. Pikachu uses Thundershock to hit Pidgeotto, weakening it and allowing Ash to toss a Pokeball. The ball takes Pidgeotto in and drops to the ground and starts swaying, and after a few moments the ball stops moving, meaning Ash has captured the Pidgeotto. Despite the success, Misty continues to berate him for his lack of knowledge about strategy, and honestly, can't fault Misty at all for that, because Ash I guess he tried to use some sort of strategy using Caterpie to battle it. It's better than not battling Pidgeotto at all, but the strategy wasn't good at all.
Yes! We got Pidgeotto!
A couple of bits of trivia here. This is so far the only episode in which a main character catches two Pokemon of different species, which I was actually surprised at. I was thinking surely some point a main character would have caught two Pokemon of separate species in the following over 1,000 episodes, but apparently not. Apparently episode 3 is the only time where this happens. And this also happens to be the first episode where type advantages are mentioned. We get the pretty obvious type advantage of flying type moves being effective against bug type Pokemon. And before we move on here, just a dub change, which is when Misty is telling Ash that birds eat worms, there's a shot where she slaps him for putting his Pokemon in danger, and this was cut from the dub. Oddly enough, the sound effect of the slap is actually kept in, and this is much like the first episode, which I kind of alluded to a bit earlier, where they took out a slap between Misty and Ash, and there's another one here. They really loved Misty slapping Ash early on in this show, and they took it out again, except they kept the sound effect for whatever reason. This change isn't really glaring or anything, though. You don't really notice it unless you're looking for it or you already know that it happened. So yeah, it's not a huge change, and again, I I can see why they did it. They don't want any controversy in the show's kind of early life cycle, so they're playing it safe. So after Team Rocket made their debut in the last episode, they're going to make their immediate return here at the end of that episode, they made a pact to specifically catch Ash's Pikachu because apparently it's special when really it's not, and they are just completely mistaken. Team Rocket intrudes on their argument, reciting their motto. They decide to target Ash's Pikachu, mentioning his incredible power, which causes them to become distracted in a short internal argument before they decide to attack. They then send out Coughing and Ekans to battle, despite a double team being unfair. Misty wants to jump in, but Ash says he doesn't want to break the rules, which is I'll get to it in a little bit, but it's just a weird little quirk here. Coughing's Sludge attack blinds Pikachu, taking Pikachu out of the battle. While Ash hands Pikachu off to Misty, he decides to send out his newly caught Pidgeotto, which dodges both Coughing and Ekans' attacks, before going into a quick attack. Ekans avoids the attack by going underground, forcing Pidgeotto to come to a sudden stop. Coughing then fires a Smog attack, which Pidgeotto splits with its wings before dodging multiple Sludge attacks and Ekans' retaliation. Despite soaring high into the sky, both Ekans and Coughing are able to keep up with Pidgeotto, and Pidgeotto tries to hit Coughing with Gust but misses and ends up being defeated. So, touching on Team Rocket here, it really feels like they've settled on them being bumbling idiots and not having a serious bone in them here. They're completely comedic relief. In their debut episode, which was the episode before this, they have sort of a pretty... They're not completely serious, they're a little bit jokey and played off for comedic relief, but there's an element of seriousness and an element of danger when they show up, but here they're just completely comedic relief, and I think they've finally settled on, you know what, this Team Rocket trio, they're not going to be serious business, they're going to be comedic foils for Ash to just beat up on whenever we need to, kind of round out an episode. We also here get the iconic shot of Ash turning his hat backwards and throwing the Pokeball when he releases Pidgeotto for the first time, which I never knew that it came from here. I mean, why would you know that? Would be such an obscure thing to be able to rattle off in your head. But yeah, it's nice to see that and just be like, oh, that's the iconic shot that is etched into so many kids from that era's mind. We also have a little bit of trivia here. Ash mentions that the Pokemon League has regulations stating that trainers may only use one Pokemon at a time in battles. We have to assume that this rule may have changed years later though, because obviously in the advanced generation, as most people would know, 2-on-2 battles are not considered unusual, and we actually have a gym that utilizes 2-on-2 battles. So yeah, at the time, 2-on-2 battles weren't a thing, so it wasn't too weird for Ash saying it. Although it is strange that Ash is so strict on the rules, and it's like, this isn't an official battle. This is like 3 people trying to steal your Pokemon. Who cares about the rules? But Ash is a real stickler for him here, and it's just like, Ash, what are you doing? I guess it kind of does play into his naive rookie character at this point, so it sort of does fit. But yeah, in reality, you would just probably be like, you know what, this is just a random battle in a forest against a bunch of thieves. I'm going to do whatever I can to protect my Pokemon. But back to the battle at hand. Ash recalls Pidgeotto and tries to fight Team Rocket with his fists, but James easily holds him back. So I just got to stop there. Ash doesn't want to battle with 2 Pokemon. He's complaining about 2-on-2 battling being unfair, and he's not going to stoop to those dirty tricks of Team Rocket. Yet, when his Pidgeotto faints, he tries to just beat the shit out of Team Rocket. Just a little bit strange there that he's okay with that, but he's not okay with just having a legitimate Pokemon battle. I'll try to ignore that. In a final attempt, Ash sends out Caterpie, which only amuses Team Rocket. Ekans and Coughing attack, and Caterpie cowers, but Ash orders him to use String Shot. The attack completely incapacitates Coughing before Caterpie muzzles Ekans. Caterpie tackles Coughing, knocking it into Ekans and taking them both out. Meowth tries to intervene, but he is also wrapped in the String Shot. Taken by surprise, Team Rocket flee, but promise that they're going to be back.
It's time Team Rocket blasted off.
You may have won this round, but we'll be back.
Come back anytime. We'll be glad to beat you.
We did it.
We did it!
As I mentioned, Ash trying to physically fight Team Rocket is so strange, especially after he acted like he was such a stickler for the rules. And here kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about Caterpie being presented as weak, but then actually being strong as hell here. Caterpie basically wins a handicap match against Team Rocket. It's 2-on-1, and then it also ties up Meowth. So it makes it seem really strong after they had just gone out of their way to say it was weak. Even Pidgeotto didn't really stand a chance against Ekans and Coughing. It held its own for a little bit, but it was ultimately overwhelmed. And then this Caterpie that we've basically been told by the show multiple times is a weakling just comes out and beats them with basically not a whole lot of resistance. It's a little bit weird. I guess they want to play up that, oh no, Caterpie actually is strong, but all their actions before that really, it doesn't really jive with it. It's a bit, as I mentioned earlier, I'm saying this word a lot throughout this episode, disjointed. We've got an error here. When Ekans and Coughing go in to attack Caterpie, Ekans' Japanese voice is heard, which not a huge error, but if you spot it, it definitely is a little bit different. We also have a dub change. In the English version, the scenes where Ekans and Coughing each tackle Pidgeotto, knocking it out in the process, was slowed down, while in the Japanese version, they each tackle Pidgeotto at a faster pace. I have no idea why this was changed. That's something you're going to have to ask 4Kids about. Ash congratulates Caterpie on coming through with the victory, and after a little bit of encouragement, Misty also pats Caterpie on the head. At that moment, Caterpie begins to spray silk from its mouth, which startles Misty, and Ash puts Caterpie down as the threads start to cover its body entirely. And this is actually signaling its evolution. Caterpie evolves into Metapod, and Ash's Pokédex notes that it has reached this stage more quickly than other Caterpie on record. In addition, Misty shows approval of Ash's strengthening bonds with his Pokémon. Despite having fewer reservations about Metapod, the sight of a Beedrill scares Misty, who looks forward to leaving the forest, which is not going to happen until after the next episode, unfortunately for her.
Hey, wait for me!
Come on! We've got lots of Pokémon to catch!
The future looks bright for our heroes now, but up ahead, the Viridian Forest is deeper and darker than they know, and a dangerous new challenge is waiting.
So Caterpie going into a cocoon to evolve into Metapod is very strange and stands out like a massive sore thumb. A broken thumb, I would even say, because they never really have Pokemon evolve like this ever again. They just have the stock standard, they glow white and here's the next level. But here they kind of get too cute. They're like, oh, well, it's a caterpillar going into a butterfly, which has got real life, actual, it's metamorphosis, but we'll call it evolution for the sake of this. But it's real life evolution. Let's follow it. Let's be kind of cool like that. But I don't know, it's kind of dumb. Everybody familiar with the games is like, they just level up, they get to a certain level and they evolve. It's not some natural process, and it kind of doesn't make sense. It kind of doesn't jive with what Dexter says about, Caterpie has reached this stage more quickly, because as far as we see, Caterpie just decides to cover itself in its string shot and then it gets to be Metapod. Why wouldn't a Caterpie just do that straight away? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. A bit of trivia here. In this episode, when Caterpie evolves into Metapod, obviously it shoots the white silk string from its mouth and does the metamorphosis / evolution. And later episodes will show Caterpie evolving like the rest of the Pokemon do, which again, that makes this moment stand out even more. This is actually the first episode in which evolution is shown at all, which would be very jarring, especially if you're a kid who hasn't played the games yet. You're like, oh, okay, this is how you evolve. And if you had played the games and then watched this, you'd be like, not really sure about that. That's not exactly how it happens in the games. Why can't I do that in the games? And this was actually the first time a main character catches a Pokemon that would later evolve in this same episode. The second time being more than 500 episodes later in the episode The Thief That Keeps On Thieving. This takes place in the Sinnoh region, and it's actually Jessie involved here. She catches a Yanma and it evolves into Yanmega in the same episode. So shout out to Jessie and her Yanmega. So I think so much happens in this episode in terms of Ash's team and I think it's kind of goes under the radar how much happens here. He catches Caterpie, catches Pidgeotto, and then evolves Caterpie into Metapod. Essentially, he just acquired 3 new Pokemon in one episode, which is insane. I don't think he even comes close to doing that. Definitely not in the original Kanto and Johto series. I don't know they said before that he has never caught multiple species of Pokemon in one episode since this. So yeah, definitely has never been repeated before, which, I don't know, you kind of don't realize that so much happened until the very end. You're like, damn, Ash not only has 2 new slots on his team filled, but he actually, saw 3 new Pokemon in this episode that he added to his team. But with that all said and done, I guess it's time to move on to my thoughts on the actual quality of the episode. As you might be able to tell throughout my episode discussion, I'm not a big fan of this episode. At first glance, it seems like it's a big action-packed episode. Like I was just saying, so much does happen here from like a team building standpoint. And if you were just to go onto Bulbapedia and look at here's what happens in the episode, you're like, gee, so much is going on. This is probably an absolute banger of an episode. But even though it has those moments, for the most part, I found it pretty boring and kind of dull. Compared to the way he acquires his Pokemon later on, getting Caterpie and Pidgeotto just seems pretty lackluster. Which, I mean, it kind of fits for him catching his first Pokemon being lackluster, and he's catching, the early route trash Pokemon, in quotes. I put trash. So it kind of fits, but I don't know. I like Ash's captures being special, and these just really don't feel that special. This also kind of applies to Caterpie's evolution into Metapod. It just sort of happens, and there's no big fanfare about him evolving a Pokemon. It's just like, oh, what the hell's happening to my Caterpie? And then it evolves, and he's like, cool, I got a Metapod. Nice. And then and then they end the episode. I didn't really like that aspect. It sort of feels like they spin their wheels here and aren't really moving anywhere. We spend so much of the episode purely on the gag that Misty is scared of bug Pokemon, and it's not a very funny joke, and the fact that we don't really see her come to terms with this fear at the end means we don't really get a resolution to this episode, something that we spend so much time on in this episode, and I think it makes the episode fall even flatter, in my opinion. And kind of what I meant in terms of spinning their wheels, in the first episode, obviously he gets to Viridian City, and then we're introduced to the series bad guys in episode 2, and he heads off to Viridian Forest. And this is the first episode where you really feel like Ash hasn't made any progress in his journey. Like, sure, they're saying he moved through the Viridian Forest, but I mean, based on the location, it's just a bunch of trees. If you look at the start of the episode and look at the end of the episode, it looks like Ash hasn't moved at all throughout the episode. So after a pretty quick start, it comes to a complete halt, which, I don't know, it just feels, I don't know, I just didn't like it. It's hard to explain that, my kind of thoughts on that sort of, that aspect. I think I probably would have enjoyed this episode more when I was a kid. Obviously, seeing Ash catch and evolve his first Pokemon would have been enough for me, like, to have this cemented as an epic episode, because, I mean, as a kid, you're rooting for Ash, you're wishing you're Ash, you basically are Ash, the character is written to be like that. So it's like you're catching your first Pokemon and evolving your first Pokemon, so it's pretty epic to see as a kid. But once you're kind of, in as a Pokemon fan, and you're not a young kid, it's not really enough to just be like, oh, Ash caught the Pokemon. I think, going back to what I was saying, there's not a whole lot of fanfare around it. It doesn't really, it's just a bit dull. On a more positive note, I really do like the amount of character development given to Caterpie here. This continues on in the next episode too, and I think the amount of character, as I mentioned earlier, given to it, it's why Bye Bye Butterfree hits so hard and has become so iconic to a whole generation of kids. They did a great job of building up this Pokemon through all 3 stages of its development. Even when, like, once it becomes Butterfree, you really don't see it that much. And I remember a few years ago, I was kind of getting into it online, as you do, about people saying, "Oh, Bye Bye Butterfree was so impactful, man. I was so sad that when Butterfree went," and I was on the antagonistic side, saying, obviously as a kid that'd probably be an emotional moment, but when you look at it now, Butterfree actually appears like maybe once or twice after it evolves. So it's like, oh, there's no really reason to care about Butterfree. If you weren't a kid, you wouldn't care about it. But now that I've actually gone back and watched these episodes, I kind of walk that argument back. It does have a whole lot of character development before it becomes Butterfree. And I think that's, well, I'm not excusing them barely having Butterfree show up. It really is enough to get you caring about this Pokemon, and just the fact that it's Ash's first caught Pokemon also helps. Overall, not a big fan of this episode, but for the character development reasons alone, I think it's a solid enough episode, and it gets a pass in my book. It's definitely, I wouldn't call it a bad episode. It's not a good episode. It's middle of the road. Just bang on average. Not too bad. Not too good. It exists. So, a recap of the major events in this episode. Ash catches a Caterpie, making it his first caught Pokemon. Ash then also catches a Pidgeotto. Team Rocket reveals to Ash that their intention is to steal his Pikachu now. Meowth is revealed to know Fury Swipes. Ash has his first, although unofficial, battle and wins. James's Coughing is revealed to know Sludge. Jesse's Ekans is revealed to know Dig. And then Ash's Caterpie evolves into Metapod. And so I mentioned Ash winning his first unofficial battle here, but unfortunately we're only keeping track of Ash Ketchum's win-loss record in actual battles, so he's still at a win-loss record of 0 wins and 0 losses. That will change in the next episode though. Actually, no, it won't. We'll have to wait until Pewter City. He does get challenged to a battle next episode, but as far as I remember, he actually doesn't complete it, but don't quote me on that, he might. I just have a feeling he doesn't complete it. But with that said, we're going to move on to the extra bits of trivia that we didn't mention throughout the episode discussion. So a little funny coincidence and a nice little trivia tidbit is that both Pokemon that Ash catches in this episode are released by the time Ash travels to the Orange Islands, which is just a massive coincidence. But it's also kind of funny to see that his first 2 Pokemon they didn't even last the first region he went to. And it would actually be, I believe Bulbasaur is the first Pokemon that Ash actually catches himself that he doesn't release, because the first 2, see you later, I'll come back for you, Pidgeotto, and yeah, they're just gone forever. Caterpie's fight with Pidgeotto and Ash's capturing of the Caterpie's fight with Pidgeotto and Ash's capturing of the latter was shown on the VHS, a sneak peek at Pokemon, which a lot of the early episodes are featured on that. And for a long time, this is actually my favourite bit of trivia about this episode. For a long time, this episode was the episode with the lowest number of human characters appearing, featuring only Ash, Misty, Jesse, and James for a total of 4. 672 episodes later, in the episode Seawaddle and Burr in Pinwheel Forest, the record was matched. Coincidentally, both of these episodes take place in a forest and feature Ash catching a bug-type Pokemon. Then 6 other Best Wishes series episodes would also share this record. They were Emolga the Irresistible, Emolga and the New Volt Switch, Oshawott Lost Skull Chop, Facing Fear with Eyes Wide Open, Scraggy and the Demanding Gothita, and Battling the Leaf Thieves. However, 1,013 episodes after Ash catches a Pokemon, the record was broken by Guiding and Awakening, which features only 3 human characters. So it took 1,000 episodes and about 7 Best Wishes episodes tying the record for the record to finally be broken. And this week, there's no extra errors and dub changes, so that does us for our sort of trivia section, which means we move on to the Pokemail. If you didn't know, the Pokemail segment is the part of the podcast where each week I ask a question to you, the listeners/viewers, depending on where you are consuming this podcast. And I ask the question and get you guys to leave a comment on the YouTube video, trying to spark a little bit of discussion about the anime, because I clearly can't get enough about the Pokemon anime discussion. The question this week is, which of Ash's Pokemon from Indigo League do you think has the best character? I think ignoring Pikachu, because it's obvious that Pikachu is probably the best developed character. That's a given. So cross him out, and who do you think is the next best from his Indigo League team? Personally, I would have to go with Charizard as the clear standout, even ignoring the further character development it gets when it leaves, when we leave the Indigo League saga. I think it's definitely the standout here, especially with the way its character kind of peaks with Ash's failure in the Pokemon League. So I think you just really can't beat that. Special shout out though to Bulbasaur and Butterfree. I think they're the closest, as I mentioned a lot about Butterfree, and in the coming episodes we'll probably talk a lot about Bulbasaur, who I think has quite a lot of personality. That basically does us for this episode. Thanks for listening to Who's That Pokemon. I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, and pretty much any podcast service except Google Play at this point. You can also find the show on Twitter at Who's That Pokemon Pod to keep up with the latest updates for the show, various Pokemon discussions and various memes about the Pokemon anime, and I guess just Pokemon in general. I don't discriminate when it comes to memes about Pokemon. I'm also on Twitter as @SourceMarlow. So yeah, that's all for this episode. I really hope you join me again next time as I take a look back at Challenge of the Samurai, which is a rather special episode because Ash finally has his first proper battle.